What should have been a moment of relief inside a hospital turns into a ruthless betrayal when a powerful CEO signs divorce papers just hours after his wife gives birth to triplets, while his mistress stands nearby, smiling. He believes he is erasing a woman at her weakest, stripping her of rights, control, and dignity, until a single detail stops him cold. The last name printed on the baby's records is not just a name. It is a trigger that sets off a chain reaction he cannot escape. What follows is not just heartbreak, but a collapse of power, reputation, and certainty, as truth moves faster than money ever could. Stay with us as this story unfolds, and tell us where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. The maternity wing of the Chicago hospital glowed under harsh white lights, the kind that stripped warmth from everything they touched. Monitors hummed and beeped in steady rhythms, filling the corridor with a mechanical pulse that felt louder in the middle of the night. The air smelled of disinfectant and metal, clean but unforgiving, as if emotion itself had been scrubbed away. Evelyn Parker lay motionless on a rolling gurney just outside the operating room. Her skin was pale beneath the thin hospital gown, the light blue fabric wrinkled from hours of strain. Clear tubing ran from her arm, taped carefully in place, delivering fluids she no longer felt. Her chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, while dark strands of hair clung to her forehead. She did not stir. She could not know what was happening only a few feet away. Dr. Helen Morris stepped out of the operating room, still wearing her white surgical coat. The exhaustion showed in the lines around her eyes, but her voice was controlled when she spoke. She explained that the emergency delivery had been extremely dangerous, that Evelyn had lost a frightening amount of blood, and that every decision in the last hour had been about survival. Her words carried weight, not drama, the tone of someone who had just fought a quiet war. 3 premature babies were already being rushed down the hall toward the neonatal intensive care unit. Each infant lay in a separate incubator, surrounded by transparent walls and blinking screens that tracked fragile vital signs. The babies were small, impossibly small, wrapped in soft blankets that looked too large for their bodies. The steady beeping from the monitors followed them, like a warning and a promise at the same time. A few steps from the delivery room door, Richard Cole stood apart from the medical staff. His navy suit was immaculate, pressed as sharply as if he had come from a boardroom instead of a hospital. His white shirt was crisp, his tie perfectly aligned. He watched the doors with the same detached focus he used when waiting on quarterly earnings reports. His expression did not change when the incubators passed by. Madison Reed appeared beside him, her wine-red dress striking against the muted hospital colors. The fabric hugged her figure, confident and deliberate, and her black heels clicked softly on the polished floor. She glanced toward the recovery area where Evelyn lay, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. It was not loud. It did not need to be. At Richard's subtle gesture, a lawyer stepped forward and placed a thin stack of papers on the glass-topped cabinet lining the hallway. The documents lay flat, neat, ready. Richard picked up the pen without hesitation. He did not ask about Evelyn's condition. He did not ask the names of the children who had just entered the world. He signed quickly, his hand steady, the motion practiced. Madison leaned in, her lips close to his ear, whispering something only he could hear. A soft laugh escaped her, light and pleased, as if she had just watched the final move of a game she knew she had already won. Dr. Morris noticed the papers and turned toward Richard, disbelief flashing across her face. She asked him directly how he could choose this moment to file for divorce while his wife lay unconscious. Her voice did not rise, but the question landed hard. Richard answered without emotion. He said family complications were a liability, a risk to his public image, and that it was better to end things cleanly and immediately. The words sounded rehearsed, stripped of any trace of personal connection. An administrative staff member approached, tablet in hand, and confirmed that the divorce paperwork had been officially submitted with Richard's signature. The process was already in motion, logged and time-stamped, as impersonal as any other transaction. Nurse Linda Chavez passed through the corridor in her teal uniform, her name badge catching the light. She slowed when she registered what was happening, her steps faltering for a brief moment. Her eyes moved from the papers to Evelyn's still form and back again, and something tightened in her expression. Through the glass walls of the NICU, Nurse Linda saw 3 tiny wristbands being printed for the newborns. She leaned closer, reading the names carefully. The surname made her pause. Parker Ellsworth. The color drained slightly from her face as recognition set in. She quietly took a photo of the wristband display, following internal protocol, then slipped her phone away without drawing attention. Around her, the hospital continued its routine, unaware of the significance contained in that single detail. Madison crossed her arms, her red dress vivid against the sterile surroundings, and glanced toward Evelyn with open disdain. Richard adjusted the collar of his white shirt, slid the pen back into his pocket, and turned away from the recovery area as if concluding a task that no longer required his presence. A nurse pushing a medication cart passed by, overhearing fragments of the exchange. She looked at Richard with shock, her mouth tightening before she quickly moved on, unsure whether she was allowed to react. Dr. Morris gripped the patient chart in her hands, her knuckles whitening. She understood how close Evelyn had come to the edge, how thin the line between life and collapse had been only minutes earlier. The contrast between that reality and the cold efficiency unfolding in the hallway made her chest ache. Richard instructed the hospital staff to direct all updates regarding the newborns to his legal representative, Dr. Morris refused, stating firmly that the only priority at that moment was the safety of the mother and the babies. Madison laughed again, louder this time, remarking that a woman who was no longer a wife had no standing to make demands. A security guard observed the tension from a distance, but did not intervene. Richard's influence was well known, and hesitation filled the space where action should have been. Inside the NICU, the 3 infants breathed with mechanical assistance, the monitors marking time with relentless precision. The sound echoed like a drumbeat beneath the surface of everything else, underscoring the fragility of what had just begun. Nurse Linda moved quickly to the nurse's station, logging into the system and searching for the keyword Ellsworth under internal alerts. The screen loaded, then displayed a single legal warning. Her breath caught as she read it. She immediately called Karen Whitfield, the hospital's legal advisor, and asked her to come to the NICU without delay. When Karen arrived moments later, dressed in a navy blazer and moving with purpose, Nurse Linda showed her the wristband record. Karen studied the name Parker Ellsworth, then looked up slowly. In a low voice, she said that what had just happened could overturn everything, possibly within a single day. The hallway fell into a tense stillness, heavy with unspoken consequences, as the machines continued to beep, and no one yet understood how much the balance had already shifted. Evelyn Parker woke to a heavy pressure in her chest, as if the air itself had weight. Her eyes burned when she tried to open them, the light too bright, too sharp. The steady beeping of a monitor filled the room, each sound landing with dull insistence, reminding her that her body was still being measured, still being watched. She tried to lift her hand. Pain flared instantly, sharp and unforgiving, stealing her breath. A weak sound escaped her throat before she could stop it. Through the haze, one thought pushed forward, louder than the pain. Her lips moved, dry and trembling, and she forced the words out. She asked about her babies. Nurse Linda stood beside the bed, her teal uniform neat, her posture careful and calm. Her voice was gentle when she answered, telling Evelyn that the babies were in the NICU and that they were very fragile. She chose her words slowly, as if each one needed to be placed just right to keep Evelyn from breaking. Tears slid down Evelyn's temples and into her hair. She had carried them for months, felt every kick, every restless movement, and now she had not touched them even once. The space between her and her children felt enormous, like a wall she could not see over. A hospital legal staff member entered the room quietly, holding a tablet. The woman addressed her as Evelyn Parker, using the name with professional distance. Her tone was flat as she explained that the marriage had been legally terminated overnight and that the procedure had been recorded as valid. The words hung in the air, unreal and cold. Evelyn stared at her, unable to process what she was hearing. She had been unconscious, she had been bleeding, she had been fighting to stay alive. The idea that her life could be dismantled while she was helpless sent a wave of shock through her chest. She asked where Richard was. The question came out soft, almost hopeful, and was met with an uncomfortable silence. The legal staff member looked down at the tablet, avoiding her eyes, offering no answer at all. Dr. Helen Morris stepped into the room, still wearing her white coat, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the fabric. She confirmed that Evelyn had survived a critical situation and that her condition was now stable. Her voice was steady, reassuring, grounded in fact. Evelyn immediately asked to see her children. The urgency in her voice surprised even her, sharp and desperate, driven by instinct rather than thought. Lying still felt impossible now that she knew they were alive somewhere nearby. The legal staff member responded that access to the babies was under temporary review due to Evelyn's medical condition. The phrase sounded rehearsed, empty of compassion. It landed like a door being shut. Evelyn's fingers curled into the blanket. The fabric bunched in her grip as a sickening realization set in. She felt as though she were being pushed out of her own life, step by step, without anyone asking her consent. Karen Whitfield entered the room then, her navy blazer smooth and composed. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked the legal staff member to step outside, making it clear that Evelyn needed space, not pressure. The request was firm enough that the woman complied without argument. Karen spoke calmly, saying that the hospital's priority had to be medical care and basic humanity, not wealth or influence. Her words cut through the tension, creating a brief pocket of safety in the room. Evelyn heard Richard's name again and felt a sharp ache spread through her chest. The abandonment finally took shape, no longer abstract, no longer distant. It was real, and it hurt more than the incision pain. Nurse Linda offered Evelyn a small cup of water and encouraged her to breathe slowly. She explained that her blood pressure was still low and stress could make it worse. Evelyn obeyed, though her hands shook as she held the cup. She asked to call her family, needing a voice that belonged to her past, to something solid. Nurse Linda checked her phone, then explained gently that it had been temporarily locked as part of administrative procedures. The explanation felt hollow, another small loss layered on top of the others. Dr. Morris explained that Evelyn needed several more hours of recovery before she could safely move. The words made sense medically, but emotionally they felt like another barrier, another delay she could not control. Even so, Evelyn tried to sit up. The effort drained her, but she refused to lie back completely. She believed, with a stubborn certainty, that seeing her children would give her strength, that it would anchor her to the world again. Karen reviewed the hospital file and noticed a series of unusual notes marked as temporary changes to decision-making authority. She asked who had requested them. The system staff avoided giving a clear answer, and the hesitation spoke volumes. Nurse Linda leaned closer and whispered that the baby's wristbands carried the surname Parker Ellsworth and that the system had triggered an alert. Evelyn heard the unfamiliar name and frowned. She had heard her mother mention it once, years ago, but it had never been explained. Karen told her to stay calm, assuring her that she was calling an emergency meeting with hospital leadership. Evelyn lay back, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though everything she had fought for was slipping through her fingers. Dr. Morris documented that Evelyn was alert, oriented, and clearly expressing a reasonable desire to care for her children. Each word written felt like a small shield, fragile but necessary. Karen requested that Evelyn be allowed at least one opportunity to see her babies through the NICU glass, citing maternal rights and emotional stability. A hallway manager arrived, stating that additional confirmation was required before access could be granted. The delay crushed Evelyn. Tears came without warning, hot and uncontrollable. It felt like punishment aimed at the weakest person in the room, imposed simply because she could not fight back. Karen met the manager's gaze and said plainly that this delay would become evidence if the matter reached court. The room fell silent after that, thick with tension and unsaid consequences. Evelyn lay there, listening to the machines, waiting, her heart aching in the quiet, suspended in a moment where nothing moved forward and everything felt painfully uncertain. That evening, Richard Cole appeared at a corporate event in downtown Chicago as if nothing had happened. The venue glowed with polished glass and soft lighting, a carefully curated space where confidence mattered more than truth. He moved through the room with measured steps, wearing a navy suit that fit him perfectly, his posture straight, his expression calm. In his hand was a glass of water, held loosely, as though even indulgence was beneath him tonight. Madison Reed stayed close at his side. Her wine-red dress stood out against the neutral tones of the room, the color bold, intentional. She smiled easily, brightly, turning toward every camera that angled their way. When photographers called Richard's name, she leaned in just enough to be seen beside him, her presence unmistakable. To a small group of guests, Madison spoke in a low, confident voice, saying that everything had been cleaned up and that Richard was free now. Her tone carried satisfaction, almost amusement. Richard did not correct her. He did not clarify. His silence worked as agreement, a quiet endorsement that required no explanation. Later, Madison posted a photo online of their hands intertwined, the image sharp and deliberate. The caption mocked the past with a reference to a fresh start. Within minutes, the post gathered attention, likes stacking rapidly, comments speculating, celebrating, congratulating. The story was being written without Evelyn. Back at the hospital, Evelyn watched the television mounted on the wall of her recovery room. The image appeared suddenly during a news segment, framed by polished headlines and smiling faces. Richard and Madison stood together, composed and unbothered. The contrast between the screen and the sterile room was unbearable. Evelyn's fingers clenched the bedsheet until her knuckles whitened. The emotional pain cut deeper than the surgical wound, stealing her breath in a way no medication could soothe. The sense of humiliation settled heavily in her chest, thick and suffocating. Nurse Linda reached for the remote and turned off the television, but the damage had already been done. The silence that followed felt charged, heavy with what could not be erased. The room seemed smaller, the air harder to draw in. Dr. Helen Morris checked Evelyn's vital signs with practiced efficiency. Her expression tightened slightly as she warned that stress could interfere with recovery, especially after childbirth. Evelyn nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the blank screen, replaying what she had seen. Elsewhere in the hospital, Karen Whitfield answered a call from the communications department. They informed her that Richard wanted to control the narrative. Karen listened without interruption, then refused outright. She stated calmly that the hospital would not be used to silence a mother for the convenience of a wealthy executive. Richard, meanwhile, stepped away from the event long enough to make a phone call. He contacted a member of the hospital's board, reminding them of previous financial contributions. The implication was clear, and the response came quickly. The board member promised the situation in the NICU would be handled quietly. Richard accepted this as expected, barely reacting. Madison leaned closer to him after the call, her voice soft but certain. She reminded him that a vulnerable mother could not stand against a CEO with resources and connections. Her smile carried absolute confidence, as though the outcome had already been decided. When Richard spoke of the 3 babies later that night, his tone was cold and detached. He referred to them as assets to be managed, responsibilities to be organized, never once as children. The language revealed more than he intended, stripping the moment of humanity. In the NICU, the machines continued their steady rhythm. The babies lay in their incubators, tiny chests rising and falling with mechanical assistance. Nurses rotated quietly, adjusting settings, recording numbers, protecting lives that had no voice yet. Nurse Linda paused by the incubators, watching them for a long moment. She reminded herself that this was not a story about money or influence, but about ethics, about doing what was right when it mattered most. The thought settled firmly in her mind. Karen sent an internal email instructing staff to secure access logs and preserve every record related to Evelyn's file. She emphasized accuracy, accountability, and transparency. Each word was deliberate, designed to hold the line against interference. Dr. Helen added her own documentation, formally confirming that Evelyn was mentally competent, fully aware, and showing no signs of impaired judgment. The statement was factual, clinical, and necessary. A hospital administrative employee hesitated before forwarding sensitive information to Karen. Fear of retaliation flickered across their face, but they sent it anyway, choosing conscience over comfort. Evelyn asked Karen in a trembling voice whether she was going to lose her children. The question carried pure fear, stripped of pride or anger. Karen met her gaze and answered carefully, telling her that the law protected mothers and that truth had a way of asserting itself, even against power. Unaware of the conversation, Madison sent a message to a hospital contact, urging them to tighten restrictions on Evelyn's access to the NICU. The tone was impatient, demanding. Karen later discovered traces of that exchange buried in the electronic system, unfinished, improperly logged. Evelyn lay still, focusing on her breathing. Each slow inhale felt like a promise she made silently to her babies, a vow to remain present, to endure. Nurse Linda prepared paperwork requesting permission for skin-to-skin contact, citing NICU care standards. Dr. Helen supported the request without hesitation, noting the benefits for premature infants. Karen scheduled an emergency meeting with hospital leadership, intent on blocking outside influence before it could deepen its reach. The atmosphere in the building shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Across the city, Richard laughed easily among guests, glasses clinking around him. Unseen, unnoticed by him, a single line of data carrying the name Ellsworth continued to move upward through internal systems, quiet and persistent, inching closer to those who could not ignore it. The next morning, Karen Whitfield received an internal alert marked with unusual priority. The subject line referenced a flag lineage associated with 3 newborns. It was brief, technical, and unmistakably serious. Karen paused before opening it, already sensing that something larger than hospital protocol had been set in motion. She pulled up the file and scrolled carefully. There it was, Parker Ellsworth, highlighted and coded at the highest level of internal priority. The designation was not decorative. It carried weight, history, and consequences that reached far beyond a single hospital floor. Nurse Linda explained quietly that the alert had triggered the moment the name bands were printed in the NICU. The system had not hesitated. It recognized the surname instantly, as if it had been waiting for it. Linda's voice remained professional, but her eyes reflected the gravity of what that recognition meant. Doctor. Helen Morris confirmed that the babies were premature and required a stable, controlled environment. Any disruption, she emphasized, could be dangerous. Her words were firm, grounded in medicine, and unyielding to outside pressure. Karen contacted the hospital's senior legal department and asked directly about the protocol connected to the Ellsworth Trust. She chose her words carefully, aware that this was no ordinary inquiry. The response came quickly. The trust, she was told, was a long-standing family protection entity with extensive legal reach and a reputation for swift action. It did not wait, it moved. Evelyn overheard the word trust and felt a chill run through her. That world was foreign to her, filled with money, contracts, and power she had never touched. Fear tightened her chest. Quiet and immediate, she spoke softly, insisting that she wanted only her right to be a mother. She did not want a fight, a spectacle, or a war she could not win. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was clear. Karen met her gaze and told her that sometimes justice needed a lawful door to enter. It was not reassurance, it was preparation. A call came through to the nurse's station. The caller identified himself as legal counsel for the Ellsworth Family Trust. His tone was calm, measured, and confident. He asked to speak with someone authorized to confirm Evelyn's safety. Nurse Linda transferred the call to Karen without hesitation. She understood instinctively that this moment no longer belonged solely to hospital administration. Karen listened as the man on the other end requested confirmation that Evelyn was safe and receiving appropriate care. His voice carried no urgency, only expectation. Karen replied honestly. She stated that Evelyn was being restricted from accessing her children in a manner that did not align with standard medical or ethical practice. The representative acknowledged the information and said the trust would send someone to the hospital that same day. The call ended without further explanation. Evelyn stared at her hands, resting on the thin blanket. They felt foreign, as if her life were being pulled into a current she could not control. Everything was moving too fast, beyond her reach. Dr. Helen suggested that Evelyn be taken in a wheelchair to the NICU hallway. The proximity, she said, could reduce anxiety and help stabilize her emotionally. It was a medical decision, rooted in compassion. A hallway supervisor objected, citing the need to await a decision. Karen responded immediately, requesting that the reason for the denial be documented in writing. The request changed the atmosphere instantly. The supervisor hesitated. Everyone in the room understood that written explanations became evidence. Silence followed before the objection dissolved. Evelyn was wheeled into the hallway. Her light blue hospital gown was wrinkled from the night, her face pale, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion and fear. The motion itself felt surreal, like drifting between worlds. She stopped in front of the NICU glass. 3 incubators stood inside, small and glowing. Evelyn pressed her hand to her chest, focusing on her breathing, grounding herself in the moment. Nurse Linda stood beside her, her voice soft but steady. She promised that no one would sever a mother's bond without a fight. The words were quiet, but they held. Karen, meanwhile, discovered a request to alter decision-making authority that had been submitted from an external email address. The timing was suspicious. The trail was incomplete. She contacted IT immediately, ordering them to lock editing access and preserve all system logs for investigation. Her tone left no room for negotiation. A message from Richard arrived shortly after, demanding that his representative receive full NICU updates. The phrasing was possessive, authoritative. Karen responded formally, stating that the hospital operated under medical guidelines and maternal rights, not personal demands. The reply was sent and recorded. Madison called Richard, dismissing the Ellsworth name as intimidation. She encouraged him to remain firm, confident that money and influence would prevail. Her certainty was unwavering. Richard accepted her reassurance. He had spent his life watching doors open at his approach. He saw no reason this one would be different. Outside the hospital, a black sedan pulled up to the entrance. The engine cut off smoothly. A man stepped out, wearing a charcoal suit, his movements composed and deliberate. He approached the front desk and introduced himself as Samuel Ellsworth. His voice was calm, his request direct. He asked to see Evelyn Parker immediately. From down the hallway, Karen spotted him. She recognized the posture, the presence, the unmistakable shift in gravity that followed him. In that moment, she knew the balance had begun to turn, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Samuel Ellsworth entered the recovery room without urgency, his charcoal suit tailored, his movements controlled. His eyes were steady, assessing the space, the monitors, the woman in the bed. Nothing about him felt accidental. He carried the calm of someone who understood timing and consequence. Evelyn watched him closely, instinctively wary. A stranger stepping into her room at her most vulnerable felt intrusive, almost threatening. She drew a slow breath, bracing herself, unsure whether this was another attempt to take something from her. Samuel spoke first. He said he had come because the 3 newborns carried the surname Parker Ellsworth, and because a protection mechanism had been activated. His voice was measured, neither soft nor forceful, as if stating a fact rather than a claim. Evelyn shook her head slightly and said she did not understand what Ellsworth meant in her life. The name sounded distant, heavy with implications she had never chosen. Samuel explained that the Ellsworth Family Trust was a family protection entity, and that the children were within a legally recognized lineage. He spoke of structure, of safeguards, of obligations. The words were precise, careful not to overwhelm. Evelyn replied quietly that she did not need money. What she needed was the right to be a mother without humiliation, without fear. Her voice wavered, but her meaning did not. Samuel answered that protection was not about money alone. It was about legal authority strong enough to block abuse when power was misused. He did not raise his voice. He did not promise comfort. He promised boundaries. Karen Whitfield sat beside Evelyn, her navy blazer immaculate, her posture grounded. She confirmed that the hospital had documented irregular interference originating from Richard's side. The acknowledgement settled in the room like a line drawn on the floor. Dr. Helen Morris added the medical file, stating clearly that Evelyn was alert, oriented, and capable of caring for her children within appropriate limits. Her signature was firm, clinical, undeniable. Samuel requested a meeting with the hospital's board to suspend all unjustified restrictions on maternal access. The request was not framed as a suggestion. It was framed as a correction. Karen arranged the meeting immediately. She recognized the shift. The weight in the room had changed direction, and it was no longer pressing down on Evelyn alone. Samuel produced a formal authorization from the Ellsworth Trust, confirming his legal standing to protect children bearing the Ellsworth name. The document was clean, unmistakable, and complete. Evelyn's voice trembled as she asked whether Richard could take her children. The fear was raw, unguarded, stripped of pride. Samuel replied that any attempt to manipulate custody would be challenged immediately. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. Nurse Linda returned with a wheelchair, her teal uniform crisp. She explained the steps calmly, preparing Evelyn for transport to the NICU under medical guidelines. Her presence grounded the moment. Dr. Helen signed an order for a designated contact window, allowing Evelyn visual access to the babies to support emotional stabilization. The pen paused only briefly before completing the order. Samuel sent a brief message to the Trust's legal team, instructing them to prepare emergency protective filings if interference continued. The action was swift, contained, and quiet. Karen requested hospital security to log any attempt by Richard or Madison to enter or influence the NICU. The request was recorded, acknowledged, and put into effect. Evelyn was wheeled down the corridor, the bright white lights reflecting off polished floors. The movement made her aware of every ache, every shallow breath, every moment she had missed. She stopped before the first incubator and placed her hand against the glass. Tears slipped down her cheeks in silence. The moment was intimate, fragile, sacred. Nurse Linda explained that the babies were stabilizing, but that each hour still mattered. Her voice carried cautious hope, tempered by reality. Samuel stood a few steps back, maintaining distance. He understood that this moment belonged to a mother, not to law or legacy. Karen received an alert that Richard had filed a request to freeze visitation, citing Evelyn's mental state. The timing was unmistakable. Samuel stated plainly that such a move would be considered manipulation without medical basis. His words were not a threat, they were a classification. Dr. Helen documented in writing that Evelyn's stress resulted from abandonment and legal pressure, not from loss of mental control. The clarification was exact, decisive. Samuel instructed that an independent evaluation process be initiated immediately to neutralize any attempt at defamation. The instruction moved forward without resistance. Evelyn asked, barely above a whisper, if she could hold one of her babies. She needed something real, something solid, to keep herself from collapsing inward. Nurse Linda began preparations for skin-to-skin contact, following NICU protocol carefully. She coordinated with the attending physician, her hands steady, her focus unwavering. Samuel told Evelyn that she would touch her child that day, and that no one had the right to prevent it without cause. The assurance settled into her chest like warmth. Karen concluded the meeting with hospital leadership swiftly, stating clearly that the institution would stand with medical ethics and human conscience. No one argued, no one interrupted. The room grew quiet after that, filled with the soft hum of machines and the steady rhythm of breathing. As everyone waited for the next moment to arrive, Richard Cole read the email twice before the meaning settled in. His access to the NICU had been temporarily suspended for review. The phrasing was clinical, neutral, but it struck him like a blow. For the first time in years, something had been taken out of his hands without warning. He stood frozen in his office, the city visible through the glass behind him. His navy suit was immaculate, pressed to perfection, yet his fingers trembled as he lowered the phone. The sensation was unfamiliar, almost humiliating, and he clenched his jaw to steady himself. Madison Reed leaned over his shoulder and saw the notification. She laughed at first, a short, dismissive sound, as if the message were nothing more than an inconvenience, but her smile faltered almost immediately. A flicker of unease crossed her eyes before she masked it. Richard dialed a hospital board member without hesitation. His voice was sharp, commanding, demanding the suspension be lifted at once. He expected compliance, or at least reassurance. Instead, the response was restrained. He was told that the Ellsworth Trust had requested an independent review, and under those circumstances, the hospital could not intervene. The words were polite, but final. Richard slammed his palm down on the desk. He was not accustomed to being denied. The impact echoed in the quiet office, underscoring his frustration. Madison urged him to act aggressively. She warned that hesitation would cost him his position beside her, his image, his authority. Fear drove her insistence, not loyalty. Richard ordered his lawyer to file an emergency motion immediately. When the lawyer cautioned that such a move could backfire, Richard cut him off. Control was his instinct, his reflex. He could not tolerate delay. A message from his assistant followed, referencing an internal union inquiry into risk to leadership conduct related to family behavior. Richard's face hardened. He snapped at the assistant, instructing them to block all inquiries. The idea of his CEO image cracking terrified him. Madison posted another confident update online, a show of defiance, but the comments shifted quickly. Praise gave way to criticism. Questions surfaced. Doubt crept in. Then the video appeared. Grainy but clear, it showed Richard in a hospital hallway, signing paperwork to refuse visitation calmly, without visible distress. The optics were devastating. Richard demanded the video be removed. He made calls, issued threats, pulled favors. It was too late. Local media had already archived it, spreading it faster than he could contain. Thomas Grant, the chairman of the board, summoned him to an emergency meeting. The request was not optional. Richard entered the boardroom moments later, his appearance flawless, but the atmosphere was cold, heavy with judgment. No one offered a greeting. Thomas spoke plainly. The board needed answers. Ethical risk, he said, directly impacted company value. The words cut through the room. Richard insisted this was a private matter. Thomas responded that it ceased being private the moment newborn children were used as leverage. The distinction was clear, unforgiving. Outside the room, Madison waited in the hallway. Her wine-red dress drew attention, but no one looked at her with respect anymore. She felt it, the subtle shift, the way influence evaporated. Another alert reached Richard's phone. Several corporate-linked accounts were now subject to audit requests from partners. The timing was no coincidence. Understanding dawned slowly. The Ellsworth Trust was not limited to hospital walls. It reached into financial systems, partnerships, pressure points he had always assumed were secure. Richard called Madison into a side office, attempting reassurance. But his voice cracked slightly. Fear bled through the edges. Madison listened, then said she did not want to be dragged down with him. She reminded him, without softness, that she had always put herself first. The statement landed like betrayal. For the first time, Richard saw the instability in her loyalty. The realization left him cold. His lawyer called again, reporting that the motion to freeze visitation had been rejected, countered by Dr. Helen's medical certification. The legal door had closed. Richard ground his teeth together. Every familiar route he had relied on was blocked. Thomas Grant sent a second meeting notice titled Leadership Review. The words made Richard's stomach tighten. His position was no longer secure. Enough waiting. Enough reacting. Richard decided he would go to the hospital himself. He needed to reclaim initiative, to confront the situation directly. Madison followed him, her heels striking the pavement sharply, each step echoing like forced confidence. She clung to appearance, even as uncertainty gnawed beneath it. The hospital doors slid open, admitting them into the sterile brightness. Richard stepped inside, jaw set, mind racing. He did not see Samuel Ellsworth waiting ahead, unseen but prepared, as the air grew heavy with the promise of collision and silence fell into place. Richard Cole moved toward the NICU with fast, deliberate strides, his navy suit flawless, his face burning with restrained fury. The corridor narrowed as he approached, the sterile lights reflecting off polished floors that offered no warmth. Every step felt like a demand, an assertion that he still belonged here. Security stepped in front of him and raised a hand, calm but firm. They informed him that his access to the NICU had been suspended. The words were simple, the effect was explosive. Richard's voice rose instantly. He demanded a manager, insisting that money and authority had always opened doors for him. His anger echoed down the hallway, drawing glances from nurses and staff who slowed their steps but did not intervene. Madison Reed lingered just behind him, her wine-red dress striking against the pale walls. She smiled thinly, a deliberate provocation, as if daring the situation to escalate further. At the far end of the corridor, Samuel Ellsworth appeared. He did not rush. His charcoal suit was understated, his posture composed. He observed Richard the way one might read a file, absorbing details without emotion. Richard noticed him and demanded to know who he was. The question came out sharp, but his tone softened unconsciously when the name Ellsworth was spoken. Something in it unsettled him. Samuel introduced himself as a representative of the Ellsworth Family Trust and instructed Richard to keep his words within bounds. His voice carried no threat, only authority anchored in certainty. Richard insisted the babies were his children. Samuel replied calmly that the children's surname had activated protective rights through their mother. The distinction landed like a wall Richard could not push through. Richard turned to Madison, searching for reinforcement. She said nothing. Her silence spoke of caution, of fear, of being officially recorded, of self-preservation. Then Evelyn Parker was wheeled into the hallway. She wore a light blue hospital gown, her face pale, her body still fragile. Yet there was steadiness in her posture, a quiet resolve that had not been there before. Evelyn met Richard's gaze. There was no pleading now. Her eyes were clear, focused, grounded in reality rather than hope. Richard took a step toward her, softening his expression, attempting the posture of reconciliation. Evelyn raised her hand, stopping him without a word. The gesture was small but final. She spoke calmly, reminding him that he had signed the divorce while she was unable to protect herself. She told him she would not forget that choice. The words carried no drama, only truth. Madison laughed loudly, trying to shake Evelyn's resolve. Evelyn did not look at her, not once. Madison's presence dissolved into irrelevance. Samuel stood beside Evelyn, maintaining respectful distance. His stance was protective, without intrusion, a visible boundary rather than a shield. Karen Whitfield arrived moments later, her navy blazer crisp. She reminded Richard that any statement made here could be formally documented. The warning was precise, professional. Richard shifted tactics, his voice dropping into something darker. He claimed Evelyn was unstable, unfit to care for premature infants. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Doctor. Helen Morris stepped forward at exactly the right moment, her white coat unmistakable. She stated clearly that Evelyn was medically competent and capable with appropriate support. The declaration cut through the tension. Madison glanced around the hallway. Nurses, doctors, and staff had paused, watching. Her smile stiffened, the performance losing its edge. Samuel requested the hospital present access logs to identify who had attempted to restrict Evelyn's rights. The request was procedural, unavoidable. Karen confirmed that IT had locked all editing functions and that every action carried a timestamp. The system would speak for itself. Richard looked around and realized the familiar deference was gone. No one lowered their eyes, no one moved to appease him. Evelyn spoke again, her voice steady. She said her children were not bargaining chips and that she would take the matter to court if necessary. The statement did not waver. Richard reached for her hand. Evelyn withdrew instantly, a clean, decisive motion that left no room for misinterpretation. Madison forced a smile and claimed Richard only wanted what was best. The words fell flat, hollow, stripped of conviction. Samuel announced that the Ellsworth Trust would file for emergency protective orders to prevent any unauthorized contact. The announcement landed quietly but irrevocably. Richard stepped back half a pace. For the first time, the power he relied on did not respond to him. The realization registered in his eyes. Security approached again and requested that Richard leave the NICU area to avoid distress to the premature infants. The request was firm, non-negotiable. Richard turned away, anger simmering beneath the surface. As he walked down the corridor, fear finally showed, unmasked and undeniable. Evelyn watched him go. She placed a hand over her heart and told herself that from this moment forward, she would fight with truth, not tears. The hallway settled into silence, heavy and waiting. The courtroom was quiet when Karen Whitfield submitted the emergency petition, the soft scrape of paper against wood sounding louder than it should have. Her posture was upright, deliberate, as if each document carried weight beyond ink. She spoke clearly about immediate protection for a mother and her children, and the room adjusted around that clarity, chairs stilled, breaths held. Samuel Ellsworth entered with his legal team and took his place without ceremony. Dark suits, controlled movements, eyes that measured rather than reacted. There was no urgency in his stride, only preparedness, as if the moment had been anticipated and met exactly on time. Evelyn was brought in by wheelchair. The pale blue of her hospital gown showed beneath a light coat, the fabric gathered carefully so it did not pull against her. Medical staff stayed close, not hovering, but present in the way professionals are when the margin for error is thin. Her hands rested on the armrests, fingers curled, grounding herself. Dr. Helen's confirmation was delivered calmly. Evelyn was alert, oriented, capable of making decisions. No impairment, no confusion. The words landed with the authority of science, steady and unemotional, and the court absorbed them. Nurse Linda followed with system records. She described timestamps, identification bands, the precise moment the Parker Ellsworth surname was printed and secured. The data was factual, unadorned, and impossible to misinterpret. It filled the room with the quiet certainty of a digital trail. Karen then presented logs, showing attempts to alter visitation access immediately after the divorce was signed. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The sequence of actions spoke for itself, a pattern revealed line by line. Richard arrived in a navy suit, tailored and familiar, but the composure he usually wore like armor was fractured. His jaw tightened as he took his seat, eyes flicking toward the bench and away again, as if the room itself refused to align with him. Behind him, Madison sat in a wine-red dress, posture composed, smile practiced. Yet her gaze avoided the center of the room. She watched reflections in polished surfaces, anywhere but forward, as though distance could be manufactured by angle alone. The judge asked Richard to explain why a divorce had proceeded while Evelyn was unconscious after childbirth. The question was simple, almost gentle. Richard answered that it had been a personal decision. The judge followed by asking why that decision intersected with the rights of newborns. Silence pressed in before Richard spoke again, thinner this time. Karen introduced emails that documented pressure on hospital administration, requests for exclusive access to NICU information. The correspondence unfolded on the screen like a map of intent, each message tightening the circle. Samuel explained the Ellsworth Trust with precision. It activated only when a child's welfare was at risk, he said, not for advantage, but for protection. The structure existed to prevent harm, not to create leverage. Richard's attorney attempted a rebuttal, but Dr. Helen's testimony cut through it. She stated plainly that Evelyn's stress had a cause, and that cause was abandonment and coercion. The room shifted as professional assessment replaced speculation. The judge turned to Madison and asked about her role in messages that encouraged restricting Evelyn's access. Madison denied involvement, her voice controlled. Karen responded by presenting communication links to a hospital intermediary. Color drained from Madison's face as recognition set in, the realization that private maneuvering had become public record. Samuel emphasized that motherhood could not be revoked by rumor or funding. His tone remained even, but the words carried a boundary that did not bend. Richard tried to redirect the discussion toward financial stability. The judge replied that infants require their mother before they require reputation. The statement settled into the room like a verdict, waiting to be finalized. Consideration turned to a temporary restraining order. The judge listened to arguments framed around safety, continuity, and medical necessity. Dr. Helen added that the NICU demanded calm, that conflict in hallways translated into measurable risk. Nurse Linda described Richard's detached demeanor during hospital visits, not as opinion, but as observation recorded in duty. Richard reacted sharply, voice raised, and was immediately instructed to remain calm. The instruction carried the weight of authority that could not be negotiated. Karen requested temporary guardianship for Evelyn to ensure consistent medical decisions. Samuel added that while the trust could support safety measures, Evelyn remained the primary decision-maker. The balance was clear, intentional. The judge asked Evelyn what she wanted. She lifted her chin, eyes steady, and said she wanted only to raise her children in peace. The simplicity of the answer left no space for argument. Richard spoke of paternal rights. The judge asked what he had done to protect mother and children during the night of birth. The question lingered. Richard did not provide an answer that satisfied it. The silence that followed was heavy, collective. The order was issued. Emergency guardianship granted to Evelyn, a restraining radius imposed on Richard. Madison sat motionless as the surname Parker Ellsworth was read aloud, the sound of it echoing with permanence. Richard looked down at the file before him, understanding settling in as the room fell quiet, the weight of what had just been decided pressing into the stillness that waited for what would come next. Thomas Grant convened the board of directors of Coal Dynamics within hours of the emergency ruling. The meeting room, usually reserved for quarterly victories and expansion charts, felt smaller than usual, its glass walls reflecting faces tightened by concern rather than confidence. Outside the room, assistants moved quietly, already sensing that something irreversible was unfolding. Richard entered last. His navy suit was immaculate, the same tailored cut he had worn to countless meetings, but the certainty that once carried him across the room was gone. He took his seat without greeting anyone, jaw set, eyes flicking from one face to another, as if measuring who had already turned against him. The board did not waste time. Ethical risk and legal exposure were placed on the table immediately, tied directly to Richard's conduct at the hospital. The words were precise, carefully chosen, but their weight pressed down on him all the same. This was no longer a private matter. It was a corporate threat. One major shareholder spoke plainly. A company of this scale, he said, could not survive the image of a chief executive who abandoned his wife after the birth of triplets and then attempted to exert influence over a neonatal unit. The damage was not hypothetical. It was already visible in market sentiment and partner communications. Thomas asked Richard to explain, specifically, why his personal influence had been used to interfere with hospital procedures. Richard tried to keep his voice steady as he denied wrongdoing, framing his actions as concern and confusion. But the denial unraveled quickly. Communication logs and preserved emails were presented, their timestamps and wording leaving little room for interpretation. A motion was raised. The board voted to initiate a formal review of Richard's leadership and to suspend his decision-making authority, effective immediately. The count was swift. The outcome was unmistakable. While the vote was being recorded, Richard's phone vibrated again and again on the table. Madison's name flashed across the screen, persistent, urgent. He ignored it. In that moment, saving his position mattered more than answering anyone, including her. Madison, meanwhile, attempted to get ahead of the narrative. She posted a public statement, polished and defensive, insisting on misunderstandings and personal attacks. The response was brutal. Comments flooded in faster than they could be deleted. Sponsors distanced themselves. Within hours, her carefully built public image fractured beyond repair. At the hospital, Karen sent a formal notice to staff and security. Any attempt to approach Evelyn in violation of the court order would result in immediate detention. There would be no ambiguity, no courtesy warnings. Samuel instructed his team to activate ongoing protective measures for Evelyn once she left the hospital. The decision was made quietly, efficiently, without drama. Safety was treated as a given, not a favor. Through the NICU glass, Evelyn cradled one of the babies in her arms during a scheduled window. The steady warmth of the small body against her chest anchored her in a way nothing else had. For the first time since everything had begun to unravel, she felt truly present, truly a mother, not a subject of conflict. Dr. Helen later confirmed that all 3 babies were responding well. With reduced disruption and controlled access, their vital signs had stabilized. The environment, she emphasized, mattered more than anything. Richard hired a crisis communications firm before the board meeting even ended. Strategies were drafted, statements prepared, narratives tested. None of it worked. The phrase, "divorced after triplets," had already hardened in public discourse, resistant to reframing. Thomas received additional letters from partners by the afternoon. Morality clauses were invoked. Ethical review conditions were triggered. The pressure multiplied. No longer confined to one boardroom, Richard sat alone as the realization settled in. His career was collapsing under the weight of choices he had dismissed as manageable. The power he believed insulated him had become the very thing accelerating his fall. Madison arrived at his office unannounced, her wine-red dress striking against the muted corporate palette. Security stopped her before she reached the door. She argued, then pleaded, then went quiet. The restriction was firm. She was no longer welcome. Standing in the hallway, Madison finally understood. She had been removed from the game the moment Richard ceased to be a symbol of victory. There was nothing left for her to claim. A local editor reached out to Evelyn with a request for an interview. She declined. Her focus was singular now. The children came first, and public attention could wait. Karen advised strategic silence. Evidence, she reminded Evelyn, had its own voice. It would speak when required. Samuel echoed the sentiment. Silence, used correctly, was strength. It did not signal surrender, it signaled control. Richard attempted to return to the hospital later that evening. Security intercepted him at the entrance, their instructions clear. He shouted about parental rights, about injustice, about entitlement. The guards did not engage. As he stepped back, the reality finally reached him. There was no remaining leverage, no hidden angle left to exploit. Thomas informed the board of the final step. A vote would be held to remove Richard from the position of CEO to protect the company. The ballots were cast. The margin exceeded what was required. Richard protested, his voice rising, but the numbers did not change. He was instructed to surrender his access card and leave the building before the end of the day. Watching the newsfeed from her phone, Madison sank into a chair. The man she had aligned herself with was no longer powerful, only disgraced. Karen relayed the update to Evelyn. She listened without satisfaction. What mattered to her was not his loss, but the quiet stability beginning to form around her children. Samuel met Evelyn's eyes and spoke softly. Justice, he said, did not need applause. It closed its own circle, and when it did, it left silence behind. 6 weeks later, the hospital corridors felt different. The sharp smell of disinfectant no longer carried the same weight, and the lights no longer pressed down on Evelyn's chest the way they once had. She stood near the discharge desk, wearing a light sky-blue maternity dress, a beige cardigan folded neatly around her shoulders, nude flats planted firmly on the floor. Her posture was calm, steady, earned. This was not an escape, it was a departure. The 3 babies were secured in their infant seats, each one small, each one breathing with a rhythm that had become the center of Evelyn's world. On every seat, the name tags were clear and unmistakable. Parker Ellsworth, printed cleanly, legally, without dispute. She checked them twice, not from doubt, but from a quiet reverence for what had been protected. Dr. Helen performed one final examination, her movements practiced and gentle. She smiled as she finished, telling Evelyn that the babies were strong enough to leave the NICU under a special care schedule. The words landed softly, without ceremony, as if strength had become an expectation rather than a miracle. Nurse Linda lingered nearby, her smile warm and unforced. She told Evelyn that not everyone could endure what she had endured and remain standing. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She only nodded, because gratitude still felt heavy on her tongue. Karen arrived with a slim folder and placed it carefully into Evelyn's hands. Inside were copies of the court orders and a clear explanation of the legal protections in place for the first 90 days. Karen's voice was steady as she outlined each step, each boundary, each safeguard designed to keep manipulation far away. Samuel spoke next, quietly. He said the Ellsworth Trust would provide discreet security if needed, but the choices ahead belonged to Evelyn alone. There was no pressure in his tone, no expectation of obedience, only respect. Evelyn met his eyes and thanked him for stepping forward when she believed she had been completely alone. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of recognition. Before leaving, Evelyn paused at the doors of the NICU. The memory of white lights, constant beeping, and sleepless fear rose uninvited. She let herself stand there for a moment, acknowledging the place where everything had been stripped down to survival. Then, she turned away. During a brief, permitted moment, she lifted one baby from the seat and held them close. The warmth was grounding. She told herself, silently and firmly, that she would raise her children with kindness, not bitterness. Outside, a modest family car waited. No cameras, no spectacle, just enough room for a mother and her children to go home. Evelyn sat in the back seat, one hand resting on the edge of a carrier, listening to the soft, even breaths behind her. The future felt real in that sound, fragile, present, alive. Karen reminded her that any contact from Richard must go through legal counsel. Emotional manipulation thrived in silence and confusion, Karen said, and neither would be allowed to return. Samuel added that he would respect whatever level of contact Evelyn chose, including none at all. The decision, he repeated, was hers. Evelyn said she wanted her children to grow up knowing the truth, but not living inside hatred. Truth would be taught, anger would not. The media continued to talk. Stories appeared and disappeared. Evelyn did not read them. She chose rest, healing, and the slow work of becoming whole. A letter arrived from Richard requesting a meeting. Her lawyer responded with the enforcement of the no-contact order. The exchange ended there. Madison lost her job soon after. Her reputation collapsed quietly, without drama, doors closing one by one. There were no speeches, no apologies that mattered. Thomas Grant announced the appointment of a new CEO at Coal Dynamics, accompanied by a public commitment to ethical leadership and family responsibility. The statement was formal, measured, final. Dr. Helen later received a handwritten note from Evelyn thanking her for choosing medical integrity over convenience. She kept it in her desk drawer. Nurse Linda archived the system logs, treating them like a reminder that small details could alter entire lives. At home, Evelyn arranged the 3 bassinets side by side in a modest living room. Daylight filtered in softly, unfiltered by hospital glass. She spoke each name slowly, carefully, as if sealing a promise into the air. When she looked at the remnants of her former life, the exhaustion, the emotional bruises, she chose not to let them dictate tomorrow. Karen checked in regularly, confirming compliance with the court orders and ensuring the silence remained intact. Samuel sent a brief message reminding Evelyn that she never needed to prove her worth to anyone. One evening, as a baby cried, Evelyn lifted them gently into her arms. The warmth filled the space where fear had once lived. She opened a window and let fresh air move through the room, noticing for the first time that it no longer smelled like a hospital. And as she looked at her children, Evelyn understood something clearly and completely. Real power was not about who demanded control, but about who stood firm for what was right. She watched the 3 Parker Ellsworth babies sleep and knew their story would begin with dignity, not fear.